UWL Campus Community. My name is Barbara Stewart. My PGPs are she, her, hers. I'm the Vice Chancellor for Diversity and Inclusion at UW-La Crosse. It is my privilege to provide the introduction of a webinar presentation of Critical Conversation Series, Voices of Uprising, The Long Path Toward Racial Justice. While we know that there has been a long history of racial unrest and lack of racial justice in America, the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, to name a few, has shook the collective conscience of our nation and indeed the world. I am pleased to present three panelists that will, each in their own way, speak to where they believe we are on the long path toward racial justice. I invite you to listen, center their voices and their experiences to learn how we may as a campus community move forward in the important work of securing racial justice for African Americans. Town hall meetings have been scheduled to provide additional opportunities for discussion. Please see that information on the Diversity and Inclusion website. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's panel, Voices of Uprising, The Long Path Toward Racial Justice. We'll begin today by pausing to recognize that the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse occupies the land of the Ho-Chunk people. Please take a moment to celebrate and honor this ancestral Ho-Chunk land and the sacred land of all Indigenous peoples. My name is Sara Docan-Morgan, and my pronouns are she, hers. I am an associate professor in the Communication Studies Department here at UWL, and also the chair of the Ethnic and Racial Studies Department. I'm going to be the moderator for today's panel, and now I'm going to give our panelists the opportunity to introduce themselves.
Good afternoon or good morning. My name is Antoiwana Williams, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Director of Multicultural Student Services. I'm a two-time alum of UW-La Crosse, and a little bit about myself. As you can tell by my Black identity, this is the work that I love. I'm passionate about making a difference in the community and lives, not only within the Black community, but for people of color. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
My name is Breaux. I'm an associate professor of ethnic and racial studies here at UWL. My PGPs are he, him, his, and my areas of study and research include African American history, kind of broadly defined, as well as African Americans in the Jim Crow era and the Civil Rights Movement. Some of my research includes African American students at predominantly white institutions, and that included the University of Minnesota, actually. So I did a lot of doctoral research in the Twin Cities. So I have a little bit of background on some of the racial history of the Twin Cities as well. So thank you for having me.
Hi, everyone. My name is Darrel Cain. My pronouns are he and him. I'm a graduate assistant at the University of Northern Iowa. I'm an alum of UWL, and I'm really here just to get people that talk. I know a lot of young people from my particular parts of the country don't really get the chance to speak up about certain things like this, so I'm here to try to lend a voice to them. So thank you all.
Sara,
Yeah,
you
Antoiwana.
know, the one thing I failed to do, I identify as she, her pronouns. So sorry.
No, thank you. Thank you. And thank you all for being here. You know, I think that one thing that's been brought up really aptly is that conversation and talking about difficult topics is actually itself an important step toward racial justice. And so today we're going to be modeling that conversation. But at the same time, I also want to acknowledge the emotional labor that goes into these types of conversations, especially for people of color. These conversations take time, they take energy, they take an emotional toll. And I think it's important to recognize that often people of color are called upon, especially when it comes to issues of race and racism in the national media, to be spokespeople or to talk about race. And at the same time, these events that have been happening nationally inflict their own trauma in and of themselves. So we brought you here today as our wonderful panelists to provide a platform for sharing your knowledge and insights. But at the same time, we also acknowledge that revisiting these topics and talking about them can be painful and hard. So thank you. It's with just so much gratitude and so much respect from me personally, but from everyone who's listening. I hope that we um, see the effort that it takes for you to engage in these conversations and admire and appreciate your willingness. So thank you. So to start off our conversation, many people and most people, I would hope, know what happened on Memorial Day in Minneapolis when George Floyd was murdered at the hands of Minneapolis police officers. And so what I'm wondering is what important background do people not know? Because there's always more to the story, right? That would deepen their understanding of this situation. And this could relate to race relations in the Twin Cities, or it could be related to law enforcement and communities of color in the Twin Cities. So, and Dr. Breaux, I know you have particular insight and knowledge on this, so maybe we can start with you for this question.
Yeah, for many people, you know, the most recent protests are viewed as a response to the killing of George Floyd. And what is interesting, I think, for a lot of African Americans is that this is really just one in a string of incidents of police brutality and a police murder of Black people, you know, that goes back quite far. And in fact, you know, even in the Twin Cities, you know, you had the killing of Jamar Clark by the Minneapolis police in November of 2015. You had the shooting, the film shooting, you know, that was kind of aired on Facebook Live from his fiance of Philando Castile in July of 2016. But then nationally and more recently, you know, you had the killing of Breonna Taylor in Tennessee or Tony McCade in Florida. And so for many people, this is about a cumulative effect, right, of police killings and police brutality. And, you know, it really kind of speaks to the complicated history of policing in the Twin Cities, in Minneapolis particularly, but in the Twin Cities and in general. And so, you know, some of the things I think are important to begin to have conversations about are the fact that the police in the United States, you know, really have an early relationship with the suppression and the oppression of Black people and Native people as well, actually. Um, but of Black people that, you know, that go back centuries. And then many police forces, you know, many police departments have their origins and their history in slavery. I mean, even in the city of Charleston, South Carolina, where you had the killings in the Mother Emanuel AME Church, you know, Charleston police force literally had its origins in trying to suppress Black and American Indian people as far back as 1637. So, you know, if you begin to come forward and look at places like the Twin Cities, you know, really policing of people of color in the Twin Cities goes back to the early 20th century. I mean, many people may not know and understand that the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples chapter in the Twin Cities was established in 1913, right? That tells you something that's extremely important. And what I think is important about that is that African Americans arrive in, the Twin Cities fairly early on, but you get this influx of people coming to the Twin Cities in the 1910s, or between 1910 and 1945, who are really coming from the South and escaping the brutal Jim Crow, that we all become familiar with. But an important part and component of that Jim Crow to remember is that a component or facet of Jim Crow was police brutality in the South, right? And so you have people who are, among other things, not only escaping segregation, but they're escaping police brutality. And the presence of the NAACP in the Twin Cities at such an early date, because it's only established in 1909, so by 1913, with a chapter in St. Paul, what you have is that people who were largely only restricted to either North Minneapolis because of racial covenants that didn't allow Black people to live anywhere else in the city, or to the Rondo neighborhood, which is in the north side of St. Paul, you have people who are escaping conditions and then arriving in a place where they think things are going to be better, and then they arrive there to face police brutality and racial segregation there as well. And so, there are incidents involving the NAACP protesting police brutality in the Black community in Minneapolis as early as June of 1922, when 4 Black men are beaten for inviting white women to a party. So, I mentioned some of these because I think all of these things are part of that cumulative impact that I'm talking about, right? And so, like many places in the United States, the Twin Cities and Minneapolis especially saw 2 rebellions. One in 1966 that was largely attributed to economic and employment discrimination in the Twin Cities, but a larger and probably a more important one for our purposes is 1967, when Minneapolis police allowed whites to attack groups of African Americans who were returning home from a community celebration, and the police aided whites who attacked African Americans in brutalizing the African Americans. And then, of course, there are groups like the American Indian Movement that are established a year after that incident, right, in direct response to American Indians or Native Americans experiencing police brutality in the Twin Cities. So it's important to keep all of that in context, and it's important to remember that now, in 2020, Blacks represent roughly about 19% of the population of the city of Minneapolis. They're 9% of the police force, which speaks to a complicated history of racial representation in terms of policing communities of color. And then probably the most astounding is that 58% or Blacks are subjects of police force 58% of the time, when it comes to uses of force by the Minneapolis Police Department. So when you take all of these things together, right, we begin to understand just how important this incident of the killing of George Floyd is in this larger context. And honestly, people are responding to the combination of all these things.
Yeah. I mean, just listening to you for those past few minutes, I've already learned a ton, but also just thinking about it in terms of, local context and national context and historical context gives us such a different picture of what's going on, rather than people responding to this one isolated incident, which some people might be too quick to assume. So thank you. We're hearing a lot of different terminology in the media lately, but sometimes these terms get conflated or it gets confusing. And so I want to start with 3 terms today, and those terms are protests, riots, and looting. So how do you define these terms, and why do you think these definitions are important?
Well, I'll start, but everyone feel free to jump in. But one of the things it's interesting. So, in my course on civil rights and the civil rights movement, some of what I try to do is establish a common language, and I think all of us When we're in situations where we're having conversations that are complex and perhaps people have different definitions of the same terms, it's important to establish a set or a list of terms just so we understand that we're communicating in a way that we all understand, right? And so, I make the distinction between, okay, most most acts of protest are just that in and of themselves, but there are various types of protest, right? There's occupation and sit-in, where you physically occupy a space, often non-violently, in an effort to kind of bring light to a situation. There's picketing, there's marching, right? There are rallies that usually don't involve much marching, but picketing is generally when you take placards and you're outside of a store and you might be protesting a particular injustice. And so we have to be sophisticated in our language, and like I said, and specific in our language, so people have an understanding of some of those things. What's interesting about riots is the term riots has been used historically in the United States to really explain white attacks on black communities. And so when people talk about like the Red Summer of 1919, where you had presumably more race riots in the United States than any other time in history for a single summer, what those really were whites who were attacking African American communities, and then they're labeled riots because African Americans engage in self-defense, right? And so in my civil rights class, students have a really hard time, and this is not just white students, this is black students and other students of color, have a really hard time with understanding the difference between gratuitous violence and self-defense, right? But all of these words kind of get caught up in the language of using looting and rioting. And so for me, what I see looting is much more sort of lawless destruction of property, stealing, and things like that, as opposed to something like foraging, because, and at least some of the footage I saw of Minneapolis, people were trying to get things like milk, and we know milk is important in protests, particularly when police reportedly started to shoot tear gas at peaceful protesters, right? And so one of the ways to treat the effect of tear gas on your eyes is to pour milk on them. And so if people are trying to get into a Target, right, or trying to get into a Cub Foods because they're being fired upon with rubber bullets and with tear gas, and the employees at the store won't sell it to them fast enough, or trying to shut down their store because they think there's this this larger kind of protest going on outside that they're concerned about. That creates a situation where people are literally by definition foraging and not looting. And foraging is the idea that you are literally trying to get supplies to treat the immediate situation, right? And so that's something that's very different just from gratuitous violence, or violence for the sake of violence. So other people, may want to have something to say about that.
My perspective, and Dr. Breaux, I agree with you a lot. I think protest, looting, rioting, often heard with MLK Jr. in the Other America, is the voices of the unheard. And when I think back about his speech on the Other America, he talks a lot about what America is not hearing. So when you think about protest, rioting, and even looting, there's this distorted image of who's actually participating in these activities. And typically, black people, when they go out and they protest, is typically organized, is structured. We're going in for a specific purpose. And yet, the media and others tend to distort what that peaceful protest, what the real intent. So it's a way to create this false narrative to make it seem as though we're these thugs, as is being portrayed in mainstream media, but it also has a lot to do with who's controlling that narrative. And then, with riots, it's typically unplanned. The one thing we don't talk a lot about is who did we learn to riot from? And white America, and it goes back to that historical piece. You think about the Boston Tea Party. It was called a party, but it was a riot. Let's not get it confused. So
Right.
it's this double standard, in my opinion, that is being held with white America versus Black America, and a historical perspective. And again, the killings in Chicago, the killings in Tulsa. We're almost coming up on 100 years of those race terror activities or massacres that occurred. Those were not considered riots. They were racial riots. So we have to really understand the history and the importance of language and who's creating that narrative. Um, and also at a time where there's some economic injustices occurring in our country. People are hungry. People are starving. People don't have money. They don't have clothes. There is still this disconnect of who's benefiting from whatever the federal government decides to give out. And sometimes it happens at the hands of those that live in those communities. But here's the most important narrative of this. A lot of times it's not the people in those communities that's engaging in the looting and rioting behavior. And so we have to also make sure that people don't just watch what's happening on the news. They're going out and they're reading. They're doing their own homework, in order for them to really understand. We already have these stereotypical views of Black people in America, but yet when it comes to this, those are the only people they zoom in on with the cameras, not the other folks. No one talks about the white supremacists that are also coming into these communities and destroying the properties. So there's a whole nother level of engagement that we have to have when we talk about riots and looting and protests. We have very specific purpose in the Black community that date back for centuries. And we're not going to change that now, but it is really to delegitimize the efforts of why the protests are even happening. And it's to take the attention off of the police brutality, the murder of George Floyd, the no knock murder of Breonna Taylor. And even within our trans community, no one wants to talk about the injustices that are occurring, from that perspective as well.
The irony is amazing, right? Thinking about like who gets framed as the criminal or criminals in these instances. The sort of ability to flip it and turn it so quickly from the sort of the victim becomes the perpetrator, as quickly as you can blink an eye, and it's really disturbing.
It's interesting that you both mentioned that, because one of the things that I often try to emphasize in teaching is the idea of labeling theory. And I don't know if people are familiar with that as a concept, but the basic idea with labeling theory is that, certain people are viewed as being deviant if they engage in a particular behavior. But often when people who belong to that same group engage in the same behavior, then they're not viewed as deviant or as seen as critically, right? And so you have literally people, doing the same thing, as Antoiwana noted, whether it's the Boston Tea Party, where you have literally sort of early white Americans dressing up as indigenous people, right? When they engage in this act of protest to kind of mask the fact that they're the ones who are engaging in this act of protest and property destruction. So yeah, it is quite, it's a fascinating phenomenon. This ability to kind of flip the script, so to speak.
And I think the other thing that always comes to mind is who's been controlling the narrative for hundreds of years. And so when people get the image of a police officer, committing murder, it doesn't fit with the narrative of police officers being the good guys. But when we see, an African American taking milk from a store, that fits within people's narrative of the criminal Black person. So I think that when these images, the events don't exist in a vacuum, but neither do the images that we're seeing. Those fit within people's kind of schemas as well. So Darrell, were you going to add something?
I was gonna add the idea, like just going back to Antoiwana and Dr. Breaux, as far as like the riots that happened in Tulsa and the Chicago summer. Um, a lot of times we try to put, like, we look at these people who are labeled as riots, excuse me, and they're just violence perpetrated by white people on blacks. That's why when I come to like labeling these incidences happening, I try to like not use these buzzwords because they distract from the overall message of things, right? So what I like to consider what's going on, like the good side of it, I like to consider the uprising, right? Because I like to make sure that the good is being portrayed more so than like like the historic things that come from like violence and perpetrated by white people. That it's not becoming the overall narrative that is being used when describing the uprising. Excuse me.
Yeah, thanks, Darrell. Appreciate that. I'm going to go to more of a concept, but also an idea, but also a movement. And I just want you to kind of think about Black Lives Matter. And when you hear this phrase, what does it bring up for you? And what do you want people to know about Black Lives Matter?
Just from my perspective, is disheartening that we even had to get to a point where Black lives had to matter. Even a hashtag had to matter. The most disturbing piece for me in the conversation is the counter narrative. All lives matter, blue lives matter. You're missing the point, people. And it's about the racial disparities within the Black community. In my personal opinion, it's about the anti-Blackness in our communities. There is some injustices that have been occurring throughout the course of this history, even into slavery, that we still have not acknowledged as in America. We have the Constitution, we have the Pledge of Allegiance, but who benefits from those policies or doctrines? It's not Black people. We're still fighting for freedom, even as we approach Juneteenth coming up this weekend. That's why most people you see, they're not celebrating freedom. They're celebrating being free-ish, ISH, because we're still fighting for those freedoms. And a perfect example is these protests. If we've made progress, we still wouldn't be in the streets fighting for police brutality within the Black community. We wouldn't be fighting for housing. We wouldn't be fighting for mass incarceration. The systemic racism that exists made this movement possible. So people think that it's just about police brutality, but it's much bigger than this one singular issue. I'll allow others to chime in, but it just frustrates me that even in a community like La Crosse, that we still have to justify our existence. We have to create platforms like this to center our voices. We shouldn't have to do that in 2020. We should be able to have a perspective that people respect and appreciate. So it just, for me, when I hear that terminology, it's this constant defending, like I'm always defending my life.
Yeah, I would add to that. I mean, I had an interesting conversation. So, largely African American students, but students of color engaged in a walkout at Logan High School in La Crosse back in November. And one of the things that they walked out, one of their major concerns is the fact that African American students are disproportionately punished for the same behavior and the same infractions as their white counterparts. And students aren't dumb. These young people are extremely intelligent, and they know when they are being treated unfairly. And so they walked out in response to that. I mentioned that because one of the people who lives in the neighborhood almost directly across from Logan came over and talked to me and said, well, why do you all have to say Black Lives Matter? Why don't you say all lives matter? Aren't all lives important? I said, you're living in an age of the tweet, and Black Lives Matter, right? That actual phrase comes from a tweet where the goal is to use as limited amount of words or languages to get your point across as quickly as possible, right? So I said, in the moment, perhaps it would have been easier or clearer if someone had said Black Lives Matter, comma, 2, right? And then that would have clarified it. But I said, in the heat of the moment and in the emotionality of the moment, right? That's what was tweeted, and that then becomes a part or a signature or a label for a larger movement, as Antoiwana said, that's rooted in a whole history of poverty and unequal education and things like that, but is very much rooted in police brutality and or just brutality against Black people, because the hashtag first appears after George Zimmerman gets off for killing Trayvon Martin, right, in Florida. And so you have a civilian who can kill a Black kid who presumably is in the wrong neighborhood, even though, right, his parent lives in that neighborhood. I mean, that in and of itself kind of speaks to the ways that Blackness gets problematized and gets criminalized, right, for just existing. And so that phrase becomes a part of a larger movement that then we hear in connection to Freddie Gray and Sandra Boyd and Michael Brown and all of these other people. But I mean, Black Lives Matter is clear about a number of things, and one of the things, again, I often make reference to the things I talk about in a class or when I teach, because I try to convey this message to students. But it's that one of the things that's fascinating to me are the lessons that Black Lives Matter learned from the civil rights movement in the 1960s, right? So Black Lives Matter has a structure, although it has founders, right? All of those founders were women of color. That I understand, all of those founders identify as non-binary women of color, right? So it says something about how they view the role of sexual orientation and transgender identities and LGBTQ identities within a framework that's inclusive of African Americans, because often white movements that are LGBTQ focused don't want to talk about the issue of racism within those communities. And often in an African American community, people don't want to talk about the existence of LGBTQ people in our community. So Black Lives Matter, from its beginning, right, was trying to create a framework to talk about some of the current problems affecting Black people, and the fact that trans Black people, right, are equally as likely as any other segment of the Black community to be targeted, profiled, and abused by the police department. So when you begin to connect some of these things and you realize that Black Lives Matter, it has chapters, right? That's kind of the structure of the NAACP, but it also doesn't really have a identifiable leadership. That's, again, rooted in the fact that in the civil rights movement, people were concerned about things like group-centered leaders and leader-centered groups, right? And so the idea was to try to create something that wasn't wholly or solely dependent on an individual leader, because movements like that, right, the assassination of Martin Luther King, who by many people is viewed as the leader of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, what happened when your leader, right, is assassinated? Is that the end of the movement? And so there was a conscious decision on the part of the founders and the women who created Black Lives Matter to have a leadership structure that was much more democratic, right? And so that way it was about people tailoring these movements or this movement to the particular racial needs of whatever communities they live in. And that's an important part of Black Lives Matter that gets lost. It's not about being anti-police, it's about being anti-police brutality. It's not about being anti-white, it's about being anti-white supremacy, right? And so those things are very, very specific and very distinct things that often get confused in this conversation.
Yeah, those dichotomies, right, that make people feel like they have to choose one side, and they definitely are afraid of being, on one hand, racist or identifying as racist, but they also, I think, are unaware and unsure of what it means to be anti-racist.
Sure.
And I think afraid too of the implications of saying, well, I'm pro-Black, right? And thinking about this idea of intersectionality, I think is, it being Pride Month happening at the same time of these protests, I think that's been kind of a cool thing to see people thinking now. And you've seen the, like, all Black Lives Matter, but I do think even if they did Black Lives Matter too, somebody would still say, well, white lives matter too. So
yeah, of course.
I think they're going to be, opposition either way, unfortunately. How about you, Darrell? When you hear Black Lives Matter, what comes to mind for you, or what would you like people to know about Black Lives Matter?
I say that's the proper statement that showcased how important it is, because you see when you make just a simple statement that your life matters, right, as a Black person, how it's met with all these barriers, right? You get the Blue Lives Matter, you get the All Lives Matter, you get the White Lives Matter, right? It's showcased to the people that, like, just your very existence and trying to showcase that you belong in this world is met with so much opposition. And this is why the phrase Black Lives Matter means so much to me, is because when people can look at it and see that, like, this opposition is being shown to this one phrase, it shows that there's a problem within the society, when how Black people value themselves within the society based on how other people and other groups look at them. And it's just met with a lot of, like, pushback, and it shows the importance of a movement to make sure we can become equal in this country.
And I just add on one thing that I've been thinking about too, that's so important in this conversation. Oftentimes Black lives get lost in the shuffle. And I wanted to go back to LGBT community, and even though the intersect within our community, sometimes other movements and other issues overshadow some of the things that we still need to be talking about. And that's probably not a good example, but I just think about, even with the president and how he comes up with these other, I don't know if it's fake news or whatever kind of news, to take away or to entice people to act violently against Black people and communities of color. And for the conversation today is not that I don't want to center other voices or other communities of color, but it's given us a platform to really talk about Blackness. That's something we haven't really been able to talk about in a very long time. And I think, even when you talk about race, somehow communities are silenced when we get to these moments where race conversations are so critical. And so I just wanted to make sure that we were able to share that perspective, because we don't want anyone's issue to get lost in translation. We want all of these issues to be addressed, and sometimes that's through policy. We have to be able to dissect policy and process in order to really understand the systemic issues, the oppressions that are occurring throughout our country, and who it directly impacts. Until, I always hear, until we're all free, no one's free. And that's a very important statement for us to understand. So I just wanted to share that perspective.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that, you're saying about being free-ish. I've been thinking about that a lot lately and thinking about, you know, who's free to go for a jog or who's free to wear a hoodie or who's free to, walk a certain way or sleep in their car or whatever it might be. And those freedoms are not equally distributed across racial lines for sure. So thank you for that. So Minneapolis is geographically close to La Crosse, but I think sometimes for people who aren't involved, the events of the past few weeks seem kind of far away. And so what I'm wondering from you is either what local context might you bring to this, to our understanding, or what ways do your own experiences with racism in La Crosse help you understand these events?
And I can just, we were having a conversation about this the other day. Um, and because sometimes we don't feel like we can have these conversations all the time about our experiences, or you get met with, that didn't happen in La Crosse, that didn't happen in Onalaska, that didn't happen in Trempealeau or Holman. And it just makes you sink into your chair that people don't believe that racism exists in this community. Um, and a lot of times they, in my opinion, they get it confused with the way people vote and thinking that the way we vote, or if we're blue one year, we're a little bit more understanding of the issues. And oftentimes, with my white peers, they just don't believe it. They don't believe that we raise our children differently. I have these conversations, with my doctors, and it's good to engage in those conversations because it's informing them of who their clientele needs to be and having that understanding who's walking through the door. When George Floyd and all of the other killings, even with Breonna Taylor, I have two daughters and a son. And my conversation in my house is very different, I know for a fact, than my white colleagues. And at an early age, we're teaching. This is the sad part. We're teaching our young children how to interact with police. Who does that in this day and age? My son is 14 years old, getting ready to prepare for a driver's education. And we've had conversations before he was even able to even think about a driver's license. What it means to have your friends in the car. What it means if you get pulled over and having your identification and your registration in a visible location. Not making sudden moves. It's heartbreaking as a mother that I have to engage in conversations with my kids when they leave the house. My son was going to a different basketball court. He loves basketball and, preparing for all of his summer goals. He went to a more nice flat top court a little bit further away from the house. When George Floyd was murdered, I immediately told him, I don't want you going to that court. I want you to be close enough to the house that if something were to happen, I can get to you. Or in areas where I know people live and they can see you from their backyard. Most of my white friends don't have to tell their children that. They can go out, as you said earlier, Sara. No one censors who rides a bike and where they ride a bike. I have to tell my son, call me when you get to the court. Let me know you made it there. My daughters, you riding on the highway. Let me know when you make it back to Milwaukee. We've been conditioned from a very young age to check in. We've been conditioned from a very young age to teach how we move through spaces that we shouldn't have to teach how to move through. We're supposed to be a land of the free, right? But free from whom? It's not us. And that's where that free-ish to me comes into play, because we're still teaching some of the same behaviors and mindset that was taught to our ancestors. That's problematic in 2020. Or me being a college educated woman, you become educated to have some different liberties, to have some different privileges, and you go into the grocery store, and depending on what you like, I still have people today clutching their purse. And it's like, I go to work every day, and I've actually started saying stuff out loud. Like, really? I don't want your money. I don't want your purse. And quite honestly, I mean, me and my partner even had a conversation that we would, the next time someone did that, we would actually pay for their groceries. Just to prove a point. It's so disheartening that I can't even walk in the store and look like a certain type of person. Now, all these other people around you, all of a sudden, when we walk past you, now you want to go and hurry up and clean and clench. I don't want anything that you have. And that still happens in this community. So I'll stop there and allow others to share, but it just hurts me after being here almost 30 years that I'm still facing the same kind of issues, racist ideas and behaviors that I faced when I was a college student.
Yeah, I mean, I think Antoiwana really, kind of summed up a lot of what happens in lacrosse in terms of the racial climate of lacrosse. I've been here almost 8 years. It'll be 8 years in July. But I can distinctly, remember having a conversation with my son at the time when Trayvon Martin was shot and killed. That I saying to him, look, these are the things you have to do. If the police stop you, right? If they give you conflicting information, then you have to say, which one of those do you want me to do? Do you want me to put my hands up? Do you want me to get on the ground? What order do you want me to do it in? So they can literally follow the instructions of a police officer and not get themselves killed. I can't imagine most of my white colleagues having that kind of conversation with their children, right? I mean, to this day, when I drive, I keep my wallet and my cell phone on the dashboard visibly so that you can see it, right? So it's just off to my left when I'm driving, so I don't have to dig into my back pocket or go into my glove compartment to get proof of insurance or any of those things, because of the danger, right? That just responding to a request, right, of an officer could potentially get me shot and killed. The grocery store incidents that Antoiwana mentioned in reference, that's almost every single trip to the grocery stores here in La Crosse, right? People quick to clench their purse or lock their cars or make sure that when they see a black person, that all of a sudden their lives or their property is being threatened or in danger, and I've been in my life, I've been followed by police on UWL's campus by campus police, right? So literally, I was parked in C lot. Anyone who knows me knows that I keep my dial in my car on NPR, right? So one morning I'm coming to campus, I'm listening to Minnesota Public Radio. I'm sitting there engaged in the story, and I'm thinking, oh, that's interesting. Maybe I'll have my class listen to some of this story today, right? I get out of my car in C lot, and as all of you know, C lot is by the art building, right? I believe that's C lot, and then there's Centennial and the art building and Morris that kind of surrounds that area. And I literally had a campus officer first circle when I was in my car, listen to the radio, right? Drive down the street in front of the art building where it's accessible now for wheelchair access. Come across the walking path that goes between the art building and Centennial, right? And follow me halfway to Wimberley, which is where my office is, right? And I'm thinking to myself, why was that even necessary in that moment, right? Why was that even necessary in that moment? And so it's things like this that just it's sad that it doesn't come as a shock or a surprise, right, to other Black people when I have these conversations on campus and I talk to Black students on campus and they tell me about similar things that happened to them, or I talk to other Black faculty or even Black administrators who say, yeah, I've had to face similar situations or similar treatment on campus, and that's on campus. That's in a place that presumably people should at least have an idea of who you are or know who you are, or if you at least have a backpack or a bag, presumably you're supposed to be there. And these are things that that often people take for granted, that black students and faculty and staff have to be conscious of just in that space, not to mention out in the larger community. So at the time when I have a 14-year-old and a 19-year-old, but at the time when they were in school here in La Crosse, I remember mapping a path for both of my children from their schools and pointing out what houses people we know live in, so that if they were stopped or targeted by the police, right, they could at least try to get to some of those people and those places. So literally saying, this person lives here, that's 2 blocks away from Lincoln Middle School. This other person lives here, that's 2 blocks closer to home along this same path, right? And giving instructions, to my children about things that they have to do to stay safe. And that goes beyond, as someone like Antoiwana knows, the ways that students are often targeted or undervalued in the classroom, or have students who use racial slurs against them or towards them, and just and all of the other types of things that that parents have to worry about. So there's 2 levels of this, right? There's what we experience ourselves as Black people, and then there's what our children experience as well. So at the same time, when we are trying to protect our children and advise our children, we are dealing with our own psychological trauma about what we've had to deal with as African Americans in La Crosse as well. And so often that advice comes from our own experience, right? And it's a sad thing to have to say, but these are all things that are happening. The incident I mentioned with campus, that was last year. And I remember having the wherewithal. I took photos of the squad car parked where it was parked, and then in its various positions following me across the walkway. And I just said, you know what? I'm keeping it. I have it saved. I downloaded it to a separate disk. I just said, this is, I have to document the types of things that happen. Sadly, because people don't believe you, right? There's a common stereotype that I come across in teaching all the time, and it's, well, Black people just complain all the time, and they complain about everything, right? But when you begin to document some of the things that happen to you in photographs so that other people can see it, then it becomes a story that is believable to the people you tell it to. But the fact of the matter is, it shouldn't be happening in the first place, right? I mean, I should have to worry about my lesson plan or what I'm doing for the day, or groceries, or larger issues, but not my potential personal safety, right? When walking across the campus or in walking in La Crosse into the grocery store.
When Dr. Breaux was speaking, it reminded me of an incident, that moment when you have that family encounter. And I want to say that maybe my son would have been maybe 7 or 8. and my daughter would have just been going into her first year at Central High School, and my partner and all of us, we took our little rock box and our chairs, and my son was into football, and we took him over to Central's field. And if you are familiar with the area, you know there's the parking lot that's closest to like the baseball field, and then you have the main parking lot that goes into the side of the building. Well, closest to the baseball field, we had our first encounter with my kids of the Confederate flag and the pickup trucks.
Yeah.
It was almost like it was a meeting point, and the steam was coming out of my head. And most people that know me know I'm usually not too quiet about stuff. And in that particular moment, it was my partner. I mean, I think my life flashed before my eyes, because he was like, you know what? Let's just go. Let's not do this right now. And they started revving their engines, and what appeared to be chains, you can hear the chains hitting the cement. And I just kept saying to my kids, I'm going to jail. I literally, that was the thing I kept saying, because my first instinct was to protect them. And I don't know, my husband is 6'2", 6'3". He probably done shrunk an inch or so. He's not a small man. And for him to keep me composed in that moment is telling. But that was my son. I remember him saying so clearly to me, Mom, why don't they have an American flag? And that was before we really got into the history with him about Confederacy and what that means for Black folks. Because, you know, with some young white folks, they didn't look at the Confederate flag. They thought it was a symbol of pride. They didn't know the history and understanding of what it meant to the Black community. And so in that moment, when you're 7 or 8 years old and you have this engaging experience, you think to yourself, I feel so hopeless and powerless in front of my own children that it made me sick to my stomach. You know, so it's those moments too of having that experience in this community, and then also being called the N-word. You know, most people know me for the N-word, being called the N-word on graduation day, and no one could believe that that would ever happen in La Crosse. And it was a young white male of a young white male that literally stuck his body halfway out the back seat of a moving vehicle to make sure that I knew that's how he felt about me with my cap and gown on, you know. And so imagine all of the emotions going through your mind on graduation day. You're going into Confederate flag, I mean, 3 or 4 trucks revving their engine, to being, you know, belittled in a store, telling your kids how they need to dress, how to be prepared driving a car, when most of your friends are white, how you interact in those spaces. Who does that? There's no book on this earth that prepares you for this as a parent. You know, and it can go on and on. You know, my partner, again, 6'2", 6'3", he got pulled over driving while Black. Multiple occasions. You know, the police officer calls in, gives them the information, his height, and they still want to detain him, even though you can clearly hear them say the person is 5'9". How do you get 5'9" and 6'2" confused? You don't. You know, so it's those pieces. But the most disturbing is we're not supposed to have anything. It's the being followed because you drive a nice car. Last time I checked, I went to work every day and he did too. We deserve the same luxury that anybody else in this city deserves. You know, and even in midlife crisis, you want to drive whatever you want to drive, just like our white peers do too. We don't question them when they're driving in their Corvettes or drop tops. Why do we immediately get that label of being a drug dealer or a thug? I don't care what the history is. If you have corrected that, right? That's what corrections is about. If you've corrected that behavior and you're working, why do you have to be picked on? You've done your time, you know? And people will say things like, Uber driver, not the Uber driver, Eat Street and what's the Grubhub, I see they're driving nice. What? And then if my husband, he keeps it calm most days, but now he's learning to respond and say, this is the reason why we're riding. It's right. Comments like those, that you don't think I'm worthy enough to drive in a nice vehicle, you have to automatically assume that I'm a delivery driver. That's lacrosse. That just happened less than 3 weeks ago. So there's in this, and you can tell the emotion from all of us because it pains us that we have to deal with this. And all three of us on this call have more degrees, all four of us on this call have more degrees than half of the folks that make these ignorant comments. But we're still treated less than in 2020. So I'll stop there because the emotion is running high right now.
Well, I think as it should. I think that seems like the appropriate response, and I think that thinking about these things that happen, the acts of racism, but then coupled with other people denying or dismissing them, that's like an extra layer on top. Darrell, I want to get to you and hear what you have to say with regard to sort of events of racism that you've experienced, and now you're in Iowa. But thinking about these different incidences that people have replayed, it is lacrosse, and it's also everywhere, unfortunately, too. So, Darrell, what is there anything that came to mind for you?
Yeah, it's a bunch of things. I think about what Dr. Richard said about like people not believing you. So I like to put like names to stuff because that's kind of just how it is, because people don't believe until you put a name to it, right? So just to start off though, I think the Minneapolis and lacrosse is more of like a microcosm of a larger problem that's with interaction with like racism, right? However, for myself, I think about this one time when I was riding my bike down I forgot the street, but you know what a swamp is at? What is the skate park to the right, and it's Beef and Etc. right up there.
West, right. West Avenue.
So I wasn't at UWL yet, but like I was applying. Yep, good looking out. And I wasn't at UWL yet, but I was trying. I was applying to get in and whatnot. So, anyways, I pull up and I got my wallet in my backpack because I'm riding a bike, right? I didn't have my car, I didn't have my driver's license at the time. So I didn't want my wallet to fall out of my backpack. Fall out of my pocket, right? That happens a lot. So I get to Beef and Etc. and I think I'm about to make a left to go towards UWL, and like 3 squad cars pop up, right? Hit the curb. I'm talking about foot to the foot to the ground. You remember? Wow, right? They hop out with their pistols, like, hey, show me some identification. I'm like, oh, okay, say no more, right? So I start reaching in my backpack because, like I said, my wallet's in my backpack. And I try to get my ID out of there. He was like, don't go in your backpack. I'm like, bro, which way you want me to do? You feel me? And like, I just think the situations like that because I was so naive because I'm from Chicago and I thought like racist acts only happen like in these like not urban areas but like predominantly black areas, because it was incidents where I don't know if you had to do like the crate for the basketball hoop, but you had to cut the bottom out to shoot, to shoot in. You feel me? And we had an incident where one time me and my brother, we were doing that, and the cop pulled over and just ripped the nails out of the tree, and just threw the crate on the ground. Right? Just like I'm like, man, that's that's grimy. So when I moved to La Crosse, I was like, hey, it's gonna be a little bit better here, right? As I got older, I see how naive I was. Not only the incident with the beef and et cetera situation, but even being in high school, we had a science teacher. I think his name is Tech or Geneva Code, one of the two, right? And he was just saying like, "Hey man, I'll see you bagging my groceries in about 10 years." You feel me? And or we had
A
this one
teacher said that?
Spanish teacher. Yes, it was a teacher. Yeah, and then we had Senorita Him. She was a Spanish teacher, right? That wasn't her real name, right? So you don't have people in Spanish class have like these made up names, right? and but she was like, "I'm surprised you're still in school, right?" Just dogging on me, right? And even here in Iowa, we have a teacher named Karen Mitchell, um, and she said racism will be lessened when black people start having more kids with white people. And we know this is false, right? But this is the stuff that I go through, you know. And like I said, I put the names to it, so if anybody see this, they can ask these people why they said these things. But like, I just wanted people to know like this is type of injustice we face not only in like predominantly black area, but quote unquote affluent area, with our white counterparts. You feel me?
Yeah, thank you, Darrell. I appreciate hearing that. And as somebody who has had you for multiple classes and worked with you for so many years and over so many situations, it's especially, difficult to hear of teachers telling you that you can't or that you won't, um, because I've only seen you shine. So thank you for sharing that with me. I want to be mindful of time, but I
Thank you.
do want to hear a little bit about Richard and Antoiwana. You um, accompany UWL students along with students and faculty staff from UW Eau Claire on a civil rights pilgrimage for 10 days in January. And I kind of would like to hear, I know that time doesn't permit for you to tell us all about the trip, but I'd like to hear why do you think that knowing about civil rights history and experiencing these places physically helps us to understand current events and helps us understand racism and anti-racism?
It's a 10-day trip um, during J term to 10 cities. It includes a host of museums, the Martin Luther King birth site, Ebenezer Baptist Church, a few other churches, the Edmund Pettus Bridge and Selma, um, the new Mississippi Civil Rights Museum in Jackson, as well as the Lorraine Motel, which is now the National Civil Rights Museum, which is where Martin Luther King was assassinated in April of '68. But there's a lot of stuff in between that we just don't have the ability to cover. But I think that one of the things that we hope students learn and take away is that the racism and police brutality that people see today and the various forms of racial discrimination that people see today all are a part of a continuous chain and a legacy that is the history of the United States. And we talk about many of the subjects and the things that we've been having our conversation about today in terms of what's protest, what's a riot, what's the difference between those two, what is it what does it mean in terms of the legacy of the civil rights movement and the fact that I often tell students, I said Martin Luther King or members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee or any of those groups that were protesting during that time period, right? They were protesting not only against, again, various forms of segregation, but police brutality. Who do you think is taking Martin Luther King to jail all of the times he goes to jail, right? Who do you think is taking Rosa Parks off the bus and locking her up and fingerprinting her and putting her in jail? And these are times when we're protesting peacefully. And so, many people want to often say, well, look to Martin Luther King as an example. But I think we get a really, the pilgrimage allows students to get a fuller and much more complicated picture of all of the names and people that often go uncredited in terms of the movement. You know, you get to understand how important that women were to the civil rights movement, and churches were to the civil rights movement, and women in those churches to the civil rights movement. Um, you know, all of these are things that are important part of of the trip. And so, you know, you it's one thing to make a vague reference to Martin Luther King, you know, or someone like that protesting peacefully. It's another thing to quote Martin Luther King. Antoiwana did earlier in terms of the riots unheard, but in 1967, during his famous speech at the Riverside Church in New York against the war in Vietnam, Martin Luther King said, "I know that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government." Right? That's a direct quote, but people don't want to hear that Martin Luther King, right? They want the I Have a Dream 1963 Martin Luther King. They don't want 1967, 1968, or even 1965 Martin Luther King, because that becomes a very different message when he begins to talk about, you know, economic injustice and the connection between economic injustice and unfair treatment by law enforcement and racial segregation and some of the large other issues, including issues of self-defense that, you know, people in King's own group of bodyguards discussed all the time, because the fact of the matter is, from the beginning of the civil rights movement, their lives were in jeopardy with respect to both the general white public and white law enforcement officers. And so they knew in some cases they had to have protection, and they had to draw the line sometimes between nonviolent direct action and peaceful protest, right? And self-protection. And that's why I said we have these discussions about things like self-defense, because they become an important part and an important equation as we learn about the civil rights movement. But yeah, but I have to say, and you know, really that trip was really the brainchild of Antoiwana and Jackie Lee, who's no longer an employee at UWL. But you know, I was kind of invited in just as one of many professors. But after going on the initial trip, you know, I said to Jackie and I said to Antoiwana, I said, I'm not going to let this die, right? And so it's been my hope and part of my effort to keep that collaboration going. But it is truly a collaboration, no doubt about it. So it's you know, it's not an ERS project, but it's a collaboration between OMSS, ERS, and the Blue Gold beginnings at Eau Claire. So.
And I think for me, I think the original reason when I first met Jackie Lee, when they were interviewing to come to UWL, Jackie had shared her experience on the civil rights pilgrimage as an undergrad student at UW-Eau Claire. And I said to Jackie, before you leave here, we're going to get one started. And I mean, she didn't have any intention on leaving. She was in residence life, and their contracts come to an end as hall directors. But right before she left, we were able to get a lot of folks together. We invited a lot of different people to the table to engage in this process. And life happens for a lot of people. There was a lot of interest in education studies. There was a lot of interest in history, ethnic and racial studies, campus climate. We had a lot of interest, and it's a timing thing, you know. It wasn't about excluding anyone. It was about bringing a lot of people to the table. I just thought about my experience as an undergrad student, and even growing up. I didn't have the good fortune to learn about African American authors or African American history unless I did it on my own. And really, for me, it was coming to UW La Crosse that really got me more immersed in those cultural components. And I just always remember my mom telling me, you need to understand your history or your history is deemed to repeat itself. And I know that that's a famous quote from somebody somewhere, but I thought my mom was famous at the time when she explained that to me, and it stuck with me, you know, that I have a responsibility to make sure that a lot of our young black children don't know who they are, they don't know where they come from, and they don't know that rich history that we have throughout a lot of different process, a lot of different movements. Um, and for me, it was not only me being selfish about me learning, but also giving that role and responsibility to other young people that wanted to know and had never been to the South and never really understood the civil rights movement, never really understood protests. And for me, it was about helping people understand that there's multiple ways that we navigate through creating change. We all have different roles and responsibilities. And so go and learn for yourself, be able to think critically about what's happening now and then. And for me, the most fascinating, you talk about that speech on economic empowerment, that's what people fear the most. And that's why they destroy that fabric of our economic empowerment with Black Wall Street, the Black Business District. And we lost that. And for me, when I got down there, it fueled my fire that me and my family started a business. And that's that freest piece, that we're talking about. When you don't have to rely on the fabric and the foundation of what this country was built on, that creates a scare in a community that we've relied on for decades. No one wants to see that. And once Black people understand that history again, there's no stopping us. The power dynamic shifts and that control shifts. And that's why we're in all these racial categories, these inequities, because they don't want to see Black people get back to where they were sufficient in their own community. And that movement was happening throughout the country, not just in the South. We're a great, mighty people, but we don't talk about that Black excellence enough. And so going on that civil rights trip is a huge part of really understanding not just the negative aspects of that movement, but the positive ones too. And that we have a responsibility to be leaders no matter who's standing with us. And so we, Dr. Breaux and I, we talk about this gonna be the last one, this gonna be the last one, because there's so much more work that we want to do. And it really started with the civil rights, but Jackie and Dr. Breaux and I, we talked about this vision for being able to go into all communities of color at some point. But we got to get Underground Railroad stuff done first before we go into another community. And we just felt like if students can study abroad, they can do a domestic study tour and have an experience where they learn about who they are and where they come from and not miss out on that rich fabric of our lives. So I'll stop there. But it's been fun, to be able to connect with them. And again, it was bridging that gap across division, partnering with academic resources and the student affairs. So it is truly a partnership. And hopefully we'll get Dr. Breaux's Underground Railroad funded at some point to be able to not only have the civil rights pilgrimage, but also add in the Underground Railroad, because that's an important part of our history. And that also brings in other communities and their role in the slave trails.
And part of what Antoiwana is talking about in terms of the Underground Railroad proposal for a trip for that is is that one of my concerns along the civil rights pilgrimage is that because we go south and most of the focus is on the civil rights movement in the South, we don't talk about racism in the upper Midwest and the northern portions of the United States, and the history of how people have been influenced and impacted by racism outside of the southern United States. So um, my wife and I did a trip a couple years ago, and then I talked to Antoiwana about some of, but it would include Chicago, which was a flashpoint. I mean, Martin Luther King came to Chicago and came to Cicero, and he was run out of Chicago by liberal whites when he started exposing racism in Chicago, right? So it wasn't just about a Southern movement. There's the history of race and policing in places like Detroit, as well as Cleveland and other places. And so we talked about a trip that would essentially take us from La Crosse to the the new National African American History Museum in DC, and then back, but hitting critical civil rights points in the upper Midwest and the North, like Gary, Indiana, which was one of the first major cities to elect a black mayor, and places like that, as well as St. Catharines, Ontario, which was one of the places where Harriet Tubman settled after in Canada, right, on the Underground Railroad. And one of the places she led people to was St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada, which is kind of just across from just across the border in Canada near Niagara. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all. But yeah, and an unfortunate occasion or series of events, that have led us to have this conversation, and yet it's not a conversation that we're often allowed to have or share with the larger community. So
we often think it's just an opportunity for students, and we've had staff, non-staff of color, participate on this pilgrimage as well. Again, it's we have a responsibility, a collective responsibility to educate the masses, and that's why we were very intentional about who we brought to the table. When you think about education and education faculty, and it just didn't work out. We had 2 or 3 faculty that were interested in ed studies, but we have a responsibility to make sure moving forward that our young people know their history too in the K-12 system. And so it was to be able to share that opportunity not only with students and not just students of color, but also non-students of color. And Dr. Breaux can attest that we've had several non-students of color participate in the civil rights trip throughout the times that we've gone. But it's equally important that our students of color also have that experience as well. And so I just want to, publicly again thank him for all of his work, and Sara, to you for including a question that hits at the work that is being done within the campus community.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that, as you were talking about earlier about having to sort of prepare your children and protect your children, my thought was, what a challenging task to do that and at the same time instill pride in being Black. So you have this thing that makes life, sort of undoubtedly more difficult, that you're also supposed to be, proud of that identity. And so I think that knowing this rich history and knowing all the, amazingly brave and courageous people who have done so much, I think that would help instill pride, and at the same time teach people who are not Black history that they were never taught before, that is also tied up in their own history. So yeah, huge plug. Also want to acknowledge the fact that Dr. Breaux, while he gets his expenses reimbursed for the trip, does it for free. So it's free labor on his part as well. So that's really important point that I want to kind of make too. Okay, I have two more questions. I know that we're going over time a little bit, but I do want to address, as African Americans and as people who are deeply involved in this work, I am imagining that a lot of people have reached out to you in the past few weeks saying, what should I do? What can I do? And I want you to maybe touch upon how do these sort of questions feel to you? How do they impact you? And what should people know when they make these types of asks, these types of requests of you?
Yeah. So only a little bit, but like I know when people message me, when they ask questions like this, they don't go out and read themselves, right? So the question turns into a kind of a debate, right? They're like, "Why doesn't all lives matters?" Right? And I'm like, "Okay, well, this is why." You feel me? And that don't ask questions where you're first off you're not going to educate yourself and culturally put yourself in an understanding of like the black issues, and you have your own agenda, and then you ask these questions, right? It's a courtesy of me to be able to educate you on these things, right? And you kind of learn me into debate, and that's an issue, right? Um, I would say like also I guess my final thing is that like don't send these type of like things for support. Like they're sending like George Floyd, like his face or his things like that. Those things are very traumatic, right? And to just like pop that up on somebody's like messenger feed, right? It's and just to see it, I don't know anything to do with the situation, and to just feel like you have the audacity to just you have the free to just go ahead and put these things on somebody's messenger. You need to like kind of like prep somebody for that, and actually, is it okay if I send you something like this? Those type of things are really big issues when people are messaging me. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks, Darrell.
I've had former students who graduated from UWL even reach back and send email messages, and then of course I'm teaching the first summer session, and so there's a lot of work that I had to do with my students in terms of now kind of working the most recent developments into the curriculum so that it gives students an opportunity to process it when frankly I'm trying to process it myself, right? So I don't really have all of the answers or even know all of the important questions to ask necessarily, and yet I felt compelled and a responsibility to try to guide my students through some of what's going on psychologically at the moment. And so that's students in my current ethnic and racial studies class. For students who have had classes with me before previously, either who are current students or are now alumni of UWL but who've reached back, I've had different, I had different explanations and different conversations depending on the person and the student and what I knew they were ready for based on my experience with that student. But a number of students of color, I've said, it's really, I said, some people are going to go out and protest. If that is your role to march in the streets, then march in the streets. If your gift is filmmaking, then get your camera and go out and film people protesting, film what people are saying and get it and catch it in the moment, and then do something with it to try to educate people, about why people feel compelled to be out in the streets, despite the fact that there's a risk of getting COVID-19, right? That's a whole other layer of this that hasn't really come up in our conversation, right? But what does it mean to have the privilege to do things like show up at the state capitol in Lansing, Michigan, armed and not get any blowback from the police department or from state law enforcement. But when you are marching peacefully, right, in response to a case of a police killing, you have tear gas and rubber bullets shot at you. That's a whole other level of this. And so I said, for some people, your role is going to be educating other people, either other people of color, other black people, or white people, about why we are tired and exhausted, or as Fannie Lou Hamer said, sick and tired of being sick and tired, right? I mean, So everyone's going to have a role to play. Some people have to teach, some people have to document, some people have to be out on the streets. Sometimes some of us might do all of those things or a combination of those things, right? We need people who are policymakers and think about policy, because as there are discussions about police reform, defunding police, police abolition, those are all things that are going to take, right, bright minds and people with experience and people who have a sense of, of how historically we've tried to negotiate some of these spaces, or how historically we've created policies, right, that have been effective, only to have them overturned, say, by a conservative Supreme Court, when you're talking about things like components of the Voting Rights Act, right? The reason why we have some of the gerrymandering in the state of Wisconsin that we currently have is backlash from the Voting Rights Act and the Supreme Court chipping away at that back in 2013. So the parts that we have to play are various, but I say play to your strengths, right? Show up in those places you need to show up to make change, and by God, vote in November, right? The death of Jimmy Lee Jackson, which subsequently led to police beating peaceful black protesters in Selma in 1965 on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, right, was about, one, voting and voting rights and people trying to register to vote, and two, the famous march from Selma to Montgomery doesn't happen if the sheriff didn't murder Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was a peaceful African American protester that was a part of the Selma movement, right? So I'm now talking about police brutality, and I've mentioned over the course of this discussion, police brutality that goes back centuries and or decades. And so, like I said, it's we all have a part to play. There's so much to learn from the oral history and the written history of just Black existence, that there's plenty of work for all of us to do, and to do it well, and to do it while building each other up and supporting each other in the ways that we can.
So I'm a little older now, so the reach outs they come from different people. And now I'm at the point, as I communicated, I've been in the community a long time, so I have a different level of responsibility, and politicians have reached out to me to get on a call. It's been a little bit more difficult. I think I've shared with the three of you just the health challenges that I've faced, and my question back, and we haven't had a conversation, but my question back is, why now? I've been in this community almost 30 years, and I've never had a focus group conversation or a discussion where I was personally reached out to by a politician. Now, I'm smart enough to know that we're in an election year, right? So you have a responsibility. I've always been your constituent, but what's different now? And what is really going to change? And I don't want, I had another conversation, because in the community here, the Black community, we talk. And this is recorded, so I'm giving you a little hint that we know each other, and we talk about these things, and we laugh at you because you're being some idiots right now. And I hate to, I'm just being frank, because you had multiple opportunities to get this right. And we're still talking about the same issues. Dying in the Black community, being murdered in the Black community at the hands of the police. Not only Black men, Black women, and transgender individuals. This is not a new phenomenon. So I'm a little irritated when I get these calls that all of a sudden, when you didn't want to listen to my voice at the table, now all of a sudden my voice is valuable. What's different? I'm still the same person with the same experience and the same perspective, but now all of a sudden you want to pretend like you really want my opinion. And that's the part of getting a little older and a little wiser, that I can be more selective in who I engage with and who I don't. But the difficult part to all of this is I still have this underlying responsibility for the collective community. I still have a responsibility for the voiceless. And it pains me, it hurts me that I have to do that because my white peers don't understand and they don't get it. But the reality of it is, Black people educate ourselves about everything all the time. We're reading all the time. We're staying engaged with the issues all the time. I'm sending books to my white peers, or the university is sending a whole list of books to the whole institution that you can Google now. We're still doing the work on the backs of people of color, and particularly Black folk. Racism is not our issue. But yet here we are in the middle of a conversation to give more clear examples of how we're oppressed. That's problematic as an institution of higher education. And I say that because when they do that talk back next week, I want them to think about that. Who is this labor on? Here today, gone tomorrow. Then what are you going to do? I don't know everything about, the intersections of race, class, and gender. But because I read and I educate myself, I'm able to think critically about those issues and bring them to the table. It's not rocket scientists, And so it's hard for me to say yes at this point. And even here, as I battle cancer, I'm getting requests and still engaging because I have that responsibility. I may not be here tomorrow, but I still have that responsibility. And that's the thing that I just want as a community for us to be acknowledged for. This work still goes on, even in our darkest hours. We still have that responsibility to create an awareness for those that continue to be disenfranchised. And I give that politician example. I've gotten other ones, want to connect with the, police chief of La Crosse. And I mean, Multicultural Student Services has been here since the 70s. And I appreciate the effort. I don't want to discredit that. He's making some strides that no other police chief in the city of La Crosse has attempted to do. So I want to acknowledge that. But why now? And the politician, I asked that question too. And it's not just, again, about police brutality. That's a small piece of this. We got other people that we need to help them understand are in pain too. And today, we didn't even get to Black women. We didn't get to trans women. And I'm hoping as this series of conversation goes on, that we come back to that point, because I want people to say those victims' names too. They're just as important in this movement. Our trans Black folks that are dying at the hands of police, our Black women that are dying at the hands of police. Those are the reasons why, as much as I'm pissed off about these requests, that's why I have to still engage in these conversations, because I have to continue to educate them so that they know that those individuals have names too. And nothing will change in this country as it relates to police brutality until we bring all gender identities to the conversation. The puzzle is not complete when we leave out Breonna Taylor and Sandra Bland and Maya Hall and all those others that came before them. We have some work to do so they are no longer invisible. And we're just talking about Black women today, but that's also other women of color. We're not talking about white women because they're always at the center of the movement. When you think about violence against women, and that's the challenge. Look at those policies. Who still benefits from those policies? Sure not Black women, sure not trans women, and sure not women of color. So we have a lot of work to do, and that's where I feel like as I've gotten older, and I'm glad I'm being reached out to politicians, but they're gonna get tired of me because I'm going to put some pressure where I didn't have the time to put pressure before. Our millennials and our Gen Zs, they can focus on, and I agree with Dr. Breaux, we all have a responsibility. If they want to protest and they want to burn down, they have a right to do whatever they want to do because I was young too. And I'm not going to censor the things that they want to do. I just ask that you don't do it to your own Black community and then ask for a donation to help rebuild. It's a little problematic for me. So, but I will support them in where they're at, and I will do what I can do at that next level to help create some of those policy changes.
We're going to begin to wrap this up. I think I got to about half of my questions, but it's all right. This conversation is not discrete in any way, and it can't be. So thank you for all you contributed. Is there anything that any of you wanted to say that you weren't able to say yet today, or anything you'd like to add as we prepare to close?
I just want to make it clear about the burning down. I have millennials in my house, and they had to help me understand why they want to tear stuff up and burn stuff down. And those are my own kids. And so I have to engage and be willing to know that there's a generational perspective that we also have to acknowledge. Do I have to agree with that? Absolutely not. But I do need to respect where they're at. And so I want to make that very clear in this conversation that we have to listen to our young people too in this process.
Yeah, I would absolutely second that about listening, listening to our young people, and and for some people, that means property destruction. It means, but it's more complicated than that. And even in Minneapolis and some other cities, it's more complicated than that. There's a reason why the Wendy's that Rashad Brooks was killed outside of burned, right? Those are often symbolic of businesses that are symbolic of the oppression in a particular community that people feel often then become, right, the targets of property destruction. And I already quoted Martin Luther King in terms of critiquing that, and so I don't think there's any need to say a whole lot more about that part of it, right? I mean, do I think that property destruction and burning things down is the answer? It is an answer. It is not the only answer, and that's why I emphasize the fact that everyone has a role to play. Whether it's engaging politicians or engaging those local business people, about engaging organizations about how they perpetuate white supremacy. I mean, there was an entire dialogue. I don't use Twitter, but something came across my newsfeed in a different social network that said that Black academics were sharing some of their experiences with racism in their careers on Twitter, and I signed up for a Twitter account and started following that to be a part of that discussion, because there are expressions of racism that are happening at so many levels. We need to begin to address, cultural racism and institutional racism, as well as individual racism. I mean, all of these things are a part of that equation. And so, do whatever your part is. I emphasize the part though is that if you are of age over 18, go to the polls and vote. And for those people who are under 18 and are struggling with some of this, that's what we are here for, to to support our communities and support our young people, to navigate through some of this stuff, because the fact of the matter is this conversation is not easy for any of us here, right? And it's part of the emotional labor that Sara talked about. I thought to myself, I've never been so exhausted in my life. And at the beginning of summer, I was like, what, summer vacation? People say to me, how is summer vacation going? I said, well, I'm teaching, and I'm teaching about race and racism, and the history of discrimination, and also the history about how communities try to survive that and build in the face of that. And then simultaneously, you have the police killing people and people rebelling and responding to that. So I'm absolutely exhausted in that regard. But I feel compelled to keep pushing on and to fight, and in the ways that I know best. And and the fact of the matter is, some, like Antoiwana said, some conversations I just refuse to have. Some people reach out and they've had my number for years. They could have talked to me. I've been talking about many of the same things for years, and so you know I feel like why now is one part of that. And the other part of that is, when we are peaceful, it doesn't get us a whole lot often. Colin Kaepernick peacefully kneeled, right, during the national anthem, protesting police brutality. He is out of a job. He has not been rehired by a single NFL team, right? And so, and now people want to kneel and think that that's more respectable. But at the time, the president of the United States literally called him and his colleagues sons of bitches, right? And told their bosses to fire them because they wanted to peacefully protest. So the fact of the matter is, no form of protest is okay to some white people, and that emboldens us to protest even more, frankly, because the fact we that becomes the language with which we have to communicate with people, right? And so, why do people burn things in their communities, and sometimes burn their own communities? The same reason why people were burning the Nike products that they spent their hard-earned money on when Nike reestablished business relationships with Colin Kaepernick, and they did a commercial with him. So it's the same sort of thing, and that's a part of that same psychological phenomenon, right, that I talked about when we began with labeling theory. When you have one behavior and one group of people engages in it, and somehow it's considered much more deviant than when another group engages in that same behavior. So.
And Dr. Breaux, thanks for sharing that perspective, because I think we get so emotional that sometimes you forget to add those pieces. So I'm thankful for you to be able to share that perspective and that theory. And just for me too, I wanted to share. I'm glad you brought up the kneeling. We have to move away from that. Kneeling is unpatriotic. It is not. I mean, Colin Kaepernick actually got the kneeling from a teammate that is a member of the military. And most military folks that I know don't have a problem with the kneeling either. We get caught up in the perspectives and the narratives that we want and how it benefits us personally. And that kneeling is a much bigger movement, in my opinion. And I've thought long and hard, in America, in a country as diverse as we are, in thought, word, action, religion, perspective, however you want to look at it, why are we still pledging allegiance to a flag that don't support all of its members. And I even think about my Muslim brothers and sisters. You know, we're saying God, and maybe they say Allah, but still, we everybody don't worship the same God, but yet we're still pledging allegiance to a flag, you know, that doesn't support the identities of all the people that live in this country, citizens or not. We just don't support it. So let's get rid of the Pledge of Allegiance. Most other countries don't even have an allegiance because their countries are so diverse. It's time that America stands up. There's other ways to show our patriotism, and it doesn't have to be pledged to a flag. That's just me personally. And again, it goes back to what I said: until we're all free, no one's free, and that flag does not represent that freedom.
Yeah. It's a conversation that can go on for, I think, a really long time. So I often tell students, you know, the protest during the national anthem, even before John Carlos and Tommy Smith at the '68 Olympics in Mexico City, and long before Colin Kaepernick, you know, Jackie Robinson wrote in his autobiography, "I Never Had It Made," right, that he could not stand for the national anthem given all that he had gone through and the contradiction between America's promise and America's actions. And so people often present him as an example of, again, someone who endured and peacefully protests. But when you turn around and literally hand them his autobiography and you read his exact words, right, they speak for themselves in terms of what we have been studying for. W.E.B. Du Bois called it the double consciousness, right? People have, African American women scholars have talked about. Deborah King, one of my college sociology professors as an undergrad, talked about multiple conscious, multiple jeopardies, because it's not just a double consciousness, but it includes gender and class and sexual orientation and gender representation and presentation as well. So these are all things that hopefully, you know, the future conversations as a part of this series will engage in and take on.
Yeah, thank you. And Darrell, I want to give you an opportunity if there's anything you'd like to say in closing as well.
When I started this panel, I wanted to make sure I had a voice for people that's like me or got caught up like me when they were younger that might not have the opportunity to vote, or you feel me, they got a felony on their case, you feel me, or they got a bunch of things going on, right? So this is my thing, right? Listen, a lot of these things happen because we have low economic power in this country, right? I know my sister Antoiwana touched on it a little bit about the economic disparity we have here, right? We need to focus on our economics a lot, because a lot of the people think they can get away with these things because we don't have the power within the society to make a change, right? You know, no offense to a lot of the people that own the gas stations in our neighborhood or that own a hair salon, but they feel like they can talk crazy to the black people in their community because they own nothing in this community. They know they got to go buy their gas station. I mean, buy their gas. Excuse me. They got to go buy their hair bundles, right? You feel me? And this is one of the biggest issues in our community, right? We can't get anywhere unless we have economic strength. So with that said, I'm gonna say make sure you can start a business. You know, go grab your LLC. You know, learn about the stocks, learn about the land. Go help a big homie or something, and see if you can get fronted something. You know, for you can put into a stock. You feel me? Another thing is about self-preservation, right? A lot of times in this black community, we don't utilize our Second Amendment rights, right? Go get your license, because America is built on violence, right? So if anybody accosts you, you can properly defend yourself within your Constitution right. So I guess that's all I got to say is that I really want to speak to the people that might not have the chance to go out there and, you know, do the voting, or they don't have the academic know-how that a lot of us might have. You got to go out there and make your voice heard by your dollar.
Yeah, thank you, Darrell. And I think that kind of ties in really well with what Dr. Breaux is saying, which is do what you can do, right? And all of us can do something. And I think that sometimes people get caught up in the I don't know what to do, but sometimes it's just an excuse. So do something. For those of you who are viewing, if you would like more information, you can go to the UWL homepage and search Voices of Uprising. You can then scroll to the bottom of that page for a list of resources that is extensive and valuable. So thank you. So we're going to close today with silence for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And I know that what we covered today spans so much and could have lasted 3 hours or 3 more hours and 6 more hours after that. But I want to end today based on a great suggestion from Antoiwana that we end with 8 minutes and 46 seconds of silence to remember George Floyd and the time he spent with his neck pressed into the ground by the knee of a police officer while the fellow officers just sat alongside and watched. So we're going to conclude to remember George Floyd and countless other Black men, women, and trans individuals whose lives were ended due to state-sanctioned police violence, and then credits will follow. Thank you to Dr. Breaux, to Antoiwana, and to Darrell for your insight and your knowledge, your stories. So thank you. And thank you to all of those who helped collaborate to make this presentation possible.